Get out of my house. She screamed, and those 5 words detonated in our marble-appointed foyer like a precision-guided missile. Not because they were completely unexpected. I'd been watching our marriage disintegrate for months through a series of escalating territorial demands and entitled proclamations I'd been too trusting to properly challenge. But because she delivered them with such venomous conviction while standing in the entryway of the Westchester County estate I'd purchased entirely with my own money 5 years ago. 2 years before I'd even met her at a charity auction where she'd been working as a junior marketing executive, and I'd been the featured speaker discussing sustainable urban development, her finger pointing toward the custom mahogany door with dramatic flourish, as if she had any legal right to evict me from property whose deed bore only my name, her voice carrying that particular tone of entitled fury that made me realize she'd been systematically rewriting our marital history in her mind. Convincing herself that her recent promotion to senior vice president at Morrison and Associates Marketing somehow gave her ownership of assets she'd never contributed a single dollar toward acquiring, maintaining, or improving. While I stood there holding takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant that I'd just purchased for the dinner she'd now decided I wasn't worthy of eating in the home I'd bought paid for. And legally owned through documentation she'd apparently never bothered to verify before launching her aggressive campaign to claim everything I'd built as her personal domain, that I was now being ordered to vacate like some unwanted tenant whose usefulness had expired in her carefully orchestrated ascension to corporate prominence, that had apparently convinced her that marriage automatically transferred legal ownership of premarital assets, regardless of what the actual property deeds and financial record. Documented with irrefutable clarity. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. My name is Robert Mitchell, I'm 44 years old, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mitchell Property Development, a commercial real estate firm in White Plains that had generated over $35 million in revenue last year through strategic acquisitions and luxury residential projects, the kind of business success that had allowed me to purchase our 6-bedroom colonial estate in Scarsdale for $2.8 million in cash 5 years ago. 3 years before I'd met my wife Catherine at a Metropolitan Museum fundraiser where she'd been working as an events coordinator, and I'd been a major donor. Back when she'd been charming and appreciative in ways that seemed genuine rather than calculating and territorial in ways that would eventually transform our marriage into a battlefield, where she fought to claim ownership of everything I'd built, while contributing nothing beyond her physical presence and increasingly hostile demands that I accommodate her professional ascension by surrendering control of assets I'd acquired through 2 decades of building my company from a small property management operation. One of New York's most respected development firms, her sense of entitlement growing in direct proportion to her corporate advancement until she'd begun referring to my house and my property and my estate with such conviction that I'd started wondering if she'd somehow convinced herself that marriage automatically transferred legal ownership of premarital assets regardless of basic property law that clearly established separate ownership of assets acquired before the relationship began. Catherine, 36, had evolved from the grateful girlfriend who'd moved into my house after 8 months of dating into something far more calculating and proprietary, brilliant at leveraging her marketing position at Morrison and Associates to cultivate an image of independent success while systematically appropriating my resources, my home, my social connections, and apparently my legal property rights in ways I'd initially dismissed as enthusiasm for our partnership, but had gradually recognized as strategic positioning designed to establish her dominance over every aspect of our shared life. And for 3 years of marriage, I'd accommodated her territorial behavior because I'd believed we were building something together, never imagining that my generosity and flexibility would be interpreted as weakness she could exploit to claim ownership of property she'd never paid for, never contributed toward, and had no legal right to control despite her increasingly aggressive assertions that her house needed to reflect her standards and accommodate her career requirements in ways that systematically erased my presence and contribution while elevating her importance to a level that bore no relationship to her actual financial investment or legal ownership of anything we supposedly shared. Her transformation accelerating after her promotion to senior vice president had apparently convinced her that professional success in marketing somehow entitled her to ownership of assets I'd acquired years before our relationship began through careful financial planning and strategic business development that had nothing to do with her corporate achievements or her increasingly delusional sense of proprietorship over property she'd never purchased, never financed, and had no legal claim to despite her growing conviction that marriage had somehow transferred my premarital assets into her personal domain, that she could control through aggressive verbal assault and systematic appropriation of decision-making authority she'd never been granted by law or by agreement. The breaking point had been building for months through a series of increasingly territorial incidents that I'd initially dismissed as stress from her demanding corporate environment. But her behavior had escalated from subtle boundary violations to outright hostility whenever I exercised normal property owner prerogatives like hiring contractors, making decorating decisions, or simply existing in my own home without her explicit permission. Her sense of entitlement manifesting in demands that I consult her before making any changes to her house, and accusations that I was being controlling and financially manipulative. Whenever I reminded her that the property was legally mine, and she had no right to authorize major expenses or modifications without consultation. Her fury reaching new heights when I'd questioned her decision to hire an interior designer to redecorate my home office without permission. Spending $12,000 of our joint household account on changes I'd never approved while claiming that her house needed to reflect her vision rather than my preferences. And when I'd calmly pointed out that major property modifications required the owner's consent, she'd escalated to full-scale verbal warfare, screaming that I was trying to sabotage her career and undermine her authority in her own home. Her words revealing that she'd somehow constructed an alternate reality where my legal ownership of premarital property constituted abuse, rather than simple documentation of who'd actually purchased and paid for the assets she was now claiming as her exclusive domain through increasingly aggressive territorial behavior that had culminated in tonight's explosive confrontation, where she'd attempted to physically evict me from my own property while claiming ownership rights she'd never possessed and could never legally establish, regardless of how convinced she'd become that her marketing career somehow entitled her to everything I'd built before she'd arrived to claim it through systematic appropriation, disguised as wifely prerogatives that bore no relationship to actual law or legitimate marital rights. As I stood there in the foyer holding dinner while being ordered to leave my own property by a woman who'd contributed nothing toward its acquisition, I realized that the trusting, generous husband who'd welcomed her into his home and his life was dying, being replaced by someone who understood that if Catherine wanted to claim ownership of property she'd never paid for while attempting to evict the legal owner through aggressive verbal assault and systematic appropriation of assets. Then I would treat this like any other property dispute requiring clear documentation and strategic resolution. And as I set the takeout on the marble counter and walked to my home office to retrieve the property deed and title documents I'd stored in my safe, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to use my expertise in real estate law and strategic planning to remind my wife exactly who owned the house she was claiming as her personal domain. And when the moment was right, specifically at her upcoming promotion celebration at Morrison and Associates, where she'd invited 150 marketing industry colleagues to celebrate her ascension to senior vice president, I would present irrefutable legal documentation proving that the woman who'd screamed, "Get out of my house," had no legal claim to property she'd been systematically appropriating through aggressive territorial behavior and entitled delusion, ensuring that her moment of professional triumph would become the stage for her complete social humiliation. When 150 witnesses learned that their celebrated colleague had been attempting to evict her own husband from property he legally owned, while she contributed nothing beyond hostile demands and systematic appropriation of assets she had no right to claim. Proving that professional success in marketing doesn't automatically confer legal ownership of other people's property regardless of how convinced you become that marriage entitles you to everything your spouse built before you arrive to claim it as your exclusive domain through aggressive verbal assault and delusional territorial behavior that would soon result in consequences she'd never anticipated when she decided that the generous husband who'd welcomed her into his home was weak enough to be bullied into surrendering legal ownership of property he'd purchased with his own money years before their relationship began. The opportunity to expose Catherine's systematic appropriation of my property came within hours of her attempted eviction, when I applied the same investigative methodology I used for complex commercial acquisitions to analyze our household finances and her unauthorized modifications to my estate. And what I discovered sitting alone in my home office that Thursday evening would transform me from the trusting husband she'd tried to bully out of his own home into the architect of her complete social and legal destruction, using skills honed through 2 decades of navigating property disputes to expose the woman who'd reduced our marriage to a hostile takeover attempt disguised as domestic partnership. Her "get out of my house" scream revealing itself as strategic escalation rather than emotional outburst. Once I began documenting the systematic campaign she'd been conducting to establish false ownership claims through psychological manipulation and fraudulent representation to third parties who had no idea they were witnessing calculated property theft rather than legitimate marital authority. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The first thing I did after Catherine's explosive confrontation wasn't yell back or attempt to reason with a woman who'd clearly decided that volume and conviction could override legal reality. Instead, I silently walked past her without a word, went straight to my home office, and closed the door behind me with deliberate calmness because 20 years in commercial real estate development had taught me that emotional reactions destroy negotiating positions while documentation and strategic timing win wars. And this had just stopped being a marital disagreement and become a property dispute requiring the same methodical approach I'd use for any fraudulent claim against assets I legitimately acquired through careful financial planning and strategic business development that had nothing to do with her recent corporate promotion or her delusional sense of proprietorship over property she'd never purchased, never financed, and had no legal right to control despite her increasingly aggressive territorial behavior. In the quiet of my office, surrounded by framed blueprints and photos of completed projects that represented 2 decades of successful property development, I unlocked the wall safe behind a landscape painting and pulled out the thick leather folder containing every important document related to the Scarsdale estate. Purchase agreement showing I'd paid $2.8 million in cash 5 years ago. Property deed recorded in Westchester County with one name only. Robert Allen Mitchell, an unmarried man. Title insurance policy listing me as sole owner. Mortgage satisfaction statement confirming I'd purchased the property outright with no bank involvement. And tax records proving I'd paid all property taxes from my personal accounts, while Catherine had never contributed a single dollar toward acquisition. Maintenance or improvement of property she was now claiming as her exclusive domain through aggressive verbal assault and systematic appropriation of decision-making authority she'd never been granted by law or by legitimate agreement. Within hours, I had contacted Stephen Grant, my real estate attorney whose expertise in property law had helped me navigate complex commercial acquisitions for over a decade. And when I explained Catherine's attempted eviction and her pattern of referring to my house and my property, while authorizing unauthorized modifications, his response was immediate and unambiguous. Robert, legally this property is yours alone. New York is not a community property state. Assets acquired before marriage remain separate unless you've taken specific steps to transmute them, like adding her to the deed or using marital funds to pay down a mortgage. And since you bought the place in cash and never added her to title, she has no ownership interest whatsoever. She has occupancy rights as your spouse while the marriage exists, but she cannot evict you. Cannot claim this is her house in any legal sense. And in a divorce, this remains your separate property unless you've done something wildly foolish that would change that fundamental reality. The investigation into Catherine's systematic appropriation revealed a pattern of calculated deception that went far beyond territorial behavior. Starting with our joint household account statements showing over $42,000 in unauthorized withdrawals she'd paid to contractors, interior designers, and landscape architects she'd hired to modify my property without my consent, each invoice fraudulently listing Catherine Mitchell, owner, as the client. Creating a deliberate paper trail of misrepresentation designed to establish her false ownership claims while using my money to alter my home according to her preferences. Effectively conducting unauthorized renovations on my property while claiming credit for transforming her estate among social and professional circles who'd been systematically deceived about who actually owned the assets they were admiring during her carefully orchestrated networking events and dinner parties. The digital evidence proved even more damaging when I accessed her email correspondence with these vendors and discovered dozens of messages where she referred to me as her tenant or the husband who lives with her, systematically erasing my ownership status while cultivating an image of independent wealth and property control that bore no relationship to legal reality. Her communications revealing a calculated campaign to establish herself as sole authority over my estate, while characterizing my presence as temporary or conditional upon her approval. Creating a delusional narrative she'd apparently begun believing herself despite irrefutable documentation proving otherwise. While simultaneously planning to use her upcoming promotion celebration as the social platform for cementing her false ownership claims in front of 150 marketing industry colleagues, who would witness her moment of professional triumph in what she'd been telling them was her personal estate rather than property owned entirely by the husband she'd recently attempted to evict through aggressive verbal assault. As I compiled comprehensive evidence with the same attention to detail I'd use for any complex property title dispute, original purchase documentation, deed records, financial statements proving sole ownership, unauthorized contractor invoices, fraudulent email communications, social media posts where she claimed exclusive credit for property improvements, I realized that Catherine's explosive confrontation hadn't been emotional breakdown but strategic miscalculation in her long-term campaign to appropriate my assets through psychological dominance and systematic deception. And when I exposed her fraudulent claims at Morrison and Associates during her senior vice president celebration, where she'd invited 150 colleagues to admire what she'd been presenting as her personal achievement rather than property owned by the husband whose generosity had made her comfortable lifestyle possible, they would witness the complete destruction of her carefully constructed professional image and learn exactly who owned the estate she'd been claiming as evidence of her independent success. Ensuring that her moment of corporate triumph would become the stage for absolute social and professional humiliation when the true owner presented irrefutable legal documentation, proving that the woman they'd been celebrating for her marketing expertise had been systematically lying about property ownership, while attempting to evict her own husband from his legally documented assets. demonstrating that professional advancement in corporate marketing couldn't override fundamental property law or protect her from consequences of treating the man who'd welcomed her into his home like a disposable tenant whose usefulness had expired. Once she'd achieved sufficient status to convince herself, she deserved ownership of everything he'd built years before their relationship began. The first truly strategic decision I made that night, sitting alone in my home office with Catherine's fraudulent invoices spread across my desk, and the original deed to my Scarsdale estate resting like a loaded weapon at my elbow, was that I would not argue, plead, or attempt to reason with a woman who had just tried to evict me from my own house. Instead, if she wanted to treat our marriage like a hostile takeover of assets she never paid for, I would respond the way I responded to any attempted property grab in my professional life, with documentation, timing, and public exposure so thorough that by the time she realized what was happening, her credibility would be worth less than the paper she'd forged it on. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. 20 years of commercial real estate had taught me one unshakable truth: whoever controls the paperwork controls the property. And as I organized Catherine's contractor invoices, email printouts, and my own purchase documents into neat, logical piles, a plan began to take shape that was far colder and more calculated than anything I'd allowed myself to contemplate during our 3 years of marriage. A plan that centered on the one event Catherine valued more than anything in her current life: the promotion party Morrison and Associates was throwing in her honor in less than 3 weeks. A carefully choreographed evening at a midtown Manhattan rooftop venue, where she'd invited 150 colleagues, clients, and industry influencers to celebrate her elevation to senior vice president, an event she'd been talking about nonstop for months as the culmination of her hard work and proof that she had arrived among the New York marketing elite. What made that promotion party so critical and so perfect as a stage for her destruction wasn't just the guest list or the location, it was what Catherine had been telling people about it: that she and her husband would be hosting an exclusive pre-party cocktail at their estate in Scarsdale, offering car service to shuttle select guests from her home to the Manhattan venue, a little add-on she'd pitched to her boss as a way to humanize the celebration by showing colleagues where she really lived, which in her telling was a house she had bought, designed, and managed, with me conveniently relegated to background furniture in the story. I knew this because I'd overheard her on the phone one afternoon telling her friend from the office, "You're going to love it, wait till you see my place, it's exactly the kind of home a senior VP should have." And when the friend apparently asked what I thought, Catherine laughed and said, "Oh, Robert, he just lives there," a 6-word statement that crystallized why this party at that house was the only fitting place to strip her delusions down to bare legal reality. The next week became a study in dual roles. Catherine, I remained the quiet, slightly wounded husband giving her space after our argument, agreeing when she suggested staying with a friend for a night to cool off and not pushing when she began sleeping in the guest room because she needed better rest with all the stress. While internally I treated every interaction as part of due diligence, noting her language, tracking her communications, and carefully watching how frequently she dropped my house into conversation with decorators, caterers, and colleagues who were planning to attend the pre-party, each repetition cementing her fraudulent narrative in their minds, which made it all the more powerful when I would later show them, with notarized documents and county seals, that they'd been listening to a lie. Meanwhile, with Stephen Grant's guidance, I tightened the legal noose. We updated my will and trust documents to explicitly list the Scarsdale estate as separate property, not subject to equitable distribution in the event of divorce. We drafted a formal notice revoking Catherine's authority to make any contractual commitments on behalf of the property. And we prepared a quiet but powerful letter to be held in reserve for Morrison and Associates' HR department, documenting her pattern of misrepresentation, in case she tried to retaliate professionally once her illusions were shattered in front of her coworkers. Stephen, who had seen every variety of property scam imaginable, sat back after reviewing Catherine's emails where she signed as owner and said, "She's not just confused, Robert. She's building a record to argue in court later that the house is marital despite the deed, by showing patterns of her acting as if she owns it. That doesn't change the law, but it shows intent. If she had time, she might have persuaded a weak judge to give her a portion. You ending this now with the documentation you have protects you from years of litigation." I nodded, feeling a new, colder version of myself settling into place. Not the man who'd swallowed his outrage when she spent $12,000 from our joint account on an unauthorized redesign of my office. Not the man who'd bitten his tongue when she told friends she'd upgraded the house from his bachelor pad to our estate. But the man who understood that kindness without boundaries invites exploitation, and that sometimes the only way to stop someone from stealing what's yours is to make their attempt so publicly humiliating they never dare try again. While the legal foundation was being secured, I turned my attention to logistics. If Catherine was going to use my estate as a showroom for her fabricated image, then that house would also be the showroom for the truth. I called the AV firm we use for corporate investor presentations and hired them under my company's name to set up a portable projection system in the great room, framed as a last-minute tribute video I wanted to surprise Catherine with before we all headed to Manhattan. I had them install a ceiling-mounted screen that looked like decorative molding until activated, and I ensured their invoice went to my office, not our home, so Catherine wouldn't catch wind of anything. At the same time, I compiled a clean, compelling visual presentation, opening with a scanned copy of the original deed with my name highlighted in yellow, followed by screenshots of Westchester County property records showing me as sole owner, then the closing statement proving full cash payment pre-marriage, all contrasted against her fraudulent contractor invoices listing Catherine Mitchell owner and excerpts of her own emails where she misrepresented herself as sole proprietor of the estate. The conclusion slide was simple. Legal owner of 147 Oak Ridge Lane, Robert Allen Mitchell, in large, irrefutable font with the county clerk's seal as a background watermark. The more time I spent assembling that presentation, the more I realized how thoroughly Catherine had attempted to position herself as the queen of a castle she hadn't built. In her emails to her boss about the pre-party, she wrote, "I'm so excited to finally host the team at my home, and we've been renovating to get the house ready for you all," language that substituted her efforts and preferences for the years of work, risk, and sacrifice that had made the house possible. There was not a single mention of my company, my work, or my role in acquiring anything. To the marketing world she inhabited, Catherine had curated the story that she was a self-made woman who, through her brilliance and hustle, now lived in a home that reflected her status. I decided they deserved to know how much of that story was image and how much was theft. The weekend before the party, Emma, my 15-year-old daughter from my previous marriage, came home from her mom's place for her usual visit, and I debated how much to tell her. She'd never had much affection for Catherine's attitude, but she was still a teenager caught between adult conflicts she didn't create. In the end, I sat her down in the den and said, "Your stepmother and I are having serious problems. She's been telling people that this house is hers and that I need to leave it. Legally, that's not true. I'm going to make that clear at her promotion party. It's going to be ugly. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Emma, who had watched Catherine slowly push my things out of common areas and replace them with her curated decor, didn't look surprised. "You mean like when she told Mrs. Kaplan at the Halloween party that she designed and built this place?" Mom overheard and rolled her eyes. "We all knew she didn't pay for it. Are you finally going to call her out?" There was a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice that I recognized, not cruelty, but the hungry relief of someone who'd watched injustice for too long. "Yes," I said, in a way she can't talk her way out of. The morning of the promotion party, Catherine was electric with self-importance, moving through the house issuing directives as if she were coordinating a high-end photo shoot instead of illegally using my property as a prop for her next career move. "The caterer will set up in the kitchen, the bar goes in the great room, and make sure the cars are ready at 7 sharp. Robert, don't hang around when the team arrives. You always make things awkward with your quiet moods. Just say hello and then stay out of the way while I host, okay?" I watched her glide past me, wearing a pale gold cocktail dress and the air of a woman who believed the night belonged solely to her. The man she thought was meekly staying out of the way nodded, smiled, and mentally checked off the final items on his list. AV system tested, documents printed on heavy stock, deed framed and resting in a simple portfolio, Stephen on standby if anything escalated, and Emma by agreement at a friend's house for the night so she wouldn't have to witness the explosion. By 6:45, the estate was glowing, valet attendants at the circular drive, soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers, uplighting highlighting the stone facade. The first guests arrived at 7 sharp, Catherine's colleagues in tailored suits and designer dresses, eyes swiping over the curved staircase, the art on the walls, the expanse of glass overlooking the pool and manicured lawn. I heard the whispers I'd expected. "It's incredible, no wonder she made VP. This place is a statement." Catherine floated among them like royalty, laughing as she accepted praise for her beautiful home, never once glancing in my direction as I moved quietly near the AV controls, waiting for the right moment to end the performance she'd been staging for years in a house she didn't own, on land she'd never bought, with money she'd never earned, preparing to show 150 witnesses with notarized clarity exactly whose house she'd screamed at me to get out of. The perfect stage for Catherine's destruction presented itself at 7:45 that evening, when the last of Morrison and Associates senior executives had filtered into the great room of my Scarsdale estate with champagne flutes in hand, their voices rising in that particular pitch of corporate networking mixed with genuine admiration for the property they believed belonged to the woman now standing beneath my crystal chandelier accepting congratulations for her promotion. And as I watched her perform the role of gracious hostess while gesturing expansively at architectural details I'd selected and renovations I'd financed, telling her colleagues about her vision for transforming her estate into the perfect venue for executive entertaining, I realized that the wife who had screamed, "Get out of my house," was about to discover that her quiet, accommodating husband possessed both the documentation and strategic ruthlessness necessary to orchestrate the most comprehensive public humiliation in Morrison and Associates corporate history. A revelation that would destroy her carefully constructed professional image in front of everyone whose opinion she valued more than the marriage she'd systematically violated through fraudulent appropriation of assets she'd never earned, never purchased, and had no legal right to claim despite her increasingly delusional conviction that professional success in marketing somehow entitled her to ownership of property I'd acquired years before our relationship began. Before we continue, Please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. Catherine moved through the crowd with practiced confidence, her pale gold dress catching the light as she guided small groups through what she repeatedly called my home, explaining her design philosophy and renovation choices with the authority of someone who'd actually paid for the modifications rather than someone who'd fraudulently authorized $42,000 in unauthorized changes using my money, while systematically misrepresenting herself as the property owner to contractors, designers. And now to 150 witnesses who had no idea they were listening to elaborate fiction disguised as personal achievement. Her performance so convincing that several colleagues were photographing the interior and asking about her contractor recommendations, creating social media documentation of her fraudulent claims that would make the coming revelation even more devastating when they realized they'd been celebrating a lie told by a woman who'd attempted to evict her own husband from property he legally owned. I positioned myself near the concealed AV controls, nodding to the technician I'd hired who stood ready with the presentation loaded and tested, watching as Catherine's boss Richard Morrison raised his champagne glass and called for attention, his voice carrying across the room with executive authority. Before we head into Manhattan for the main celebration, I want to say a few words about Catherine's remarkable achievement and the vision she's demonstrated not just in her professional work, but in creating this stunning home that reflects the kind of sophisticated leadership Morrison and Associates values in our senior executives. The applause that followed was genuine and warm, colleagues genuinely impressed by what they believed was Catherine's independent success, and as she stepped forward to accept the accolades, beaming with triumph, I moved quietly to the center of the room and raised my voice with the calm authority I'd developed through 2 decades of leading investor presentations. If I may interrupt for just a moment, I'd like to provide some important context about tonight's venue that I think will enhance everyone's appreciation for what we're actually celebrating here. The room quieted immediately, 150 faces turning toward me with polite corporate attention, Catherine's expression shifting from confident hostess to something approaching alarm as she recognized that her quiet husband was about to do something she hadn't anticipated, her hand tightening around her champagne flute as I clicked the remote, and the concealed projection screen descended from the ceiling with smooth mechanical precision, transforming the great room into a presentation venue where her colleagues would witness not the tribute she might have expected, but rather the systematic destruction of every fraudulent claim she'd been making about property ownership. The first slide appeared in crisp high-definition clarity, a scanned copy of the original Westchester County deed for 147 Oak Ridge Lane, recorded 5 years earlier, the document's official seals and stamps clearly visible, with one name highlighted in bright yellow. Robert Allen Mitchell, an unmarried man, the legal designation making it unambiguously clear that this property had been purchased by me alone, years before I'd met Catherine at that charity auction where she'd been working as a junior marketing coordinator, rather than the successful executive she'd later become through career advancement that had apparently convinced her that professional promotion somehow entitled her to retroactive ownership of assets acquired before our relationship existed. "This is the deed to the property we're standing in," I said, my voice carrying the same calm precision I'd use for any complex real estate presentation. "Recorded in Westchester County 5 years ago when I purchased this estate for $2.8 million in cash, 3 years before I met Catherine at a Metropolitan Museum fundraiser. The purchase financed entirely through profits from Mitchell Property Development with no mortgage, no co-owner, and no marital funds involved because I was, as the deed clearly states, an unmarried man at the time of acquisition, making this property my separate asset under New York law regardless of our subsequent marriage or Catherine's recent tendency to refer to this estate as my house, while attempting to establish ownership claims through systematic misrepresentation." The next slide appeared. Closing statements showing I'd paid $2.8 million in cash, property tax records proving I'd paid every assessment from my personal accounts with no contribution from Catherine, title insurance listing me as sole owner, each document bearing official stamps and signatures that created an irrefutable chain of legal ownership. While murmurs of confusion began rippling through the crowd as marketing professionals who understood the power of narrative suddenly confronted the bedrock reality of legal documentation that couldn't be spun, reframed, or explained away through clever positioning or strategic messaging. Then came the devastating contrast. Contractor invoices Catherine had fraudulently authorized, each one listing Catherine Mitchell, owner, despite her having no legal right to that designation, followed by email exchanges where she'd systematically misrepresented herself to vendors as the property owner while authorizing modifications I'd never approved. Using my money to finance renovations, she then claimed credit for among social and professional circles, who were now witnessing the complete exposure of her calculated deception through her own documented fraud, displayed 10 feet tall behind her increasingly pale figure. These invoices represent over $42,000 in unauthorized modifications Catherine made to my property while misrepresenting herself as the owner. I continued, advancing through slides showing her fraudulent communications. And here are Catherine's own words describing this property as her estate, while systematically erasing my ownership status in communications with colleagues who have been invited here tonight under the false impression that you're visiting Catherine's personal residence, rather than property owned entirely by the husband she attempted to evict last week by screaming, "Get out of my house," despite having no legal right to issue such demands. The silence in the great room was absolute. 150 people frozen in horrified fascination as I systematically destroyed Catherine's reputation with her own documented evidence. Watching Richard Morrison's face harden with recognition of the massive liability, exposure his new senior vice president had created through systematic misrepresentation. Her colleagues exchanging shocked glances as they realized their social media posts celebrating Catherine's beautiful home were actually documentation of fraud, while Catherine herself stood paralyzed near the fireplace. Her carefully orchestrated promotion celebration transformed into the stage for her complete social and professional destruction, witnessed by everyone whose opinion she'd spent years cultivating through strategic networking that had just been revealed as elaborate performance designed to hide systematic appropriation of her husband's assets. Catherine tried to speak, her voice cracking. "Robert, what are you doing? This is completely inappropriate. You're trying to sabotage my promotion because you can't handle my success." But her words sounded hollow against the weight of legal documentation displayed behind her, and Richard Morrison stepped forward with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to terminating executives who'd compromised the firm's integrity. "Catherine, I expect you in my office at 9 a.m. tomorrow to discuss the implications of what we've just witnessed on your position as senior vice president. Because if you've been misrepresenting your assets to colleagues and potentially to clients, we have serious compliance issues that extend far beyond your marriage." As guests began setting down their drinks and reaching for coats, the celebration atmosphere dissolving into uncomfortable silence broken only by whispered conversations and the sound of car doors closing outside, I walked to where Catherine stood frozen, pulled out the leather folder containing the original deed, and said quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. 3 hours ago, you stood in this foyer and screamed at me to get out of your house, but as everyone can now see from official county records, this has always been my house, purchased with my money, maintained with my resources, and legally owned by me alone. Which means the only person who needs to leave is the one who's been systematically lying about owning property she never paid for, while attempting to evict the legal owner through aggressive verbal assault and fraudulent misrepresentation. That's now been exposed to everyone whose professional opinion you actually care about. The last guests filed out quickly, leaving behind empty champagne flutes and the ruins of Catherine's carefully constructed image, while I stood in the foyer of my own home, holding the deed that proved everything I'd just revealed, knowing that by morning every detail of her systematic deception would be circulating through New York's marketing community. Ensuring that her dismissive declaration about whose house this was would be remembered, as the moment she revealed her own character so completely that no amount of professional positioning could ever restore the reputation and career she just lost forever in front of everyone who mattered in her carefully curated world of corporate success that had been built on a foundation of lies about property she'd never owned, never earned, and had no right to claim despite her delusional conviction that marriage had somehow transferred my assets into her personal domain through aggressive territorial behavior that had finally been exposed for what it truly was. Systematic fraud disguised as domestic authority, conducted by a woman who'd confused professional advancement with legal ownership, and discovered too late that property law doesn't care about your job title, your social connections, or how convinced you've become that other people's assets belong to you simply because you've decided they should. The silence that followed the last guest's departure from my Scarsdale estate wasn't empty. It was pregnant with the systematic consequences I'd spent weeks preparing. And as I stood in the foyer where Catherine had screamed, "Get out of my house," just hours earlier, holding the deed that had destroyed her carefully constructed professional image in front of 150 Morrison and Associates colleagues, I felt the profound transformation from the accommodating husband who tolerated her territorial behavior to the architect of her complete social and legal destruction. Knowing that by morning, the emergency court orders would be executed, the divorce papers filed with comprehensive fraud documentation, and her carefully constructed career would begin its methodical collapse under the weight of her own documented misrepresentation, and the inevitable professional consequences that follow when executives are publicly exposed for systematically lying about property ownership, while attempting to evict their own husbands from assets they never contributed a single dollar toward acquiring, maintaining, or improving through legitimate financial contribution or legal process. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. Catherine stood frozen in the great room, her pale gold dress now seeming to weigh her down like chains, mascara streaking as the magnitude of what had just happened penetrated her shock. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its earlier authority. "You destroyed me, you humiliated me in front of my entire company, my boss, everyone I've worked with for years. How could you do this to me at my promotion party?" And I looked at the woman who'd attempted to evict me from my own property and replied with the calm precision I'd use for any complex real estate dispute. "I didn't destroy you, Catherine. I simply presented official county records proving legal ownership of property you've been fraudulently claiming as your exclusive domain. The humiliation you're feeling is the natural consequence of systematically lying about assets you never paid for while attempting to evict the legal owner through aggressive verbal assault. And if you'd bothered to verify basic property law before screaming, 'Get out of my house,' at the man whose name is on every deed and title document, you might have avoided exposing yourself to 150 witnesses as someone willing to commit fraud in pursuit of an executive image that bore no relationship to legal reality or legitimate financial contribution." The next morning brought Catherine's predictable desperation: 63 missed calls, 45 voicemails that progressed from shocked anger to sobbing pleas to threats of legal retaliation. Each message revealing her complete failure to understand that this wasn't about revenge, but about establishing clear legal boundaries with someone who demonstrated through systematic behavior that she viewed my separate property as her personal domain to be claimed through psychological dominance and fraudulent misrepresentation. That the accommodating husband she dismissed as an obstacle to her professional image had been replaced by someone who understood that property rights required documentation and enforcement, rather than endless accommodation of territorial aggression that had escalated from entitlement to attempted eviction. And that her explosive confrontation had been the final miscalculation in a campaign of appropriation that would now result in consequences extending far beyond our marriage to encompass the career she'd valued more than basic honesty about who actually owned the assets she'd been using as props for her carefully curated executive persona. Stephen Grant's comprehensive legal response moved with military precision as he filed divorce papers citing constructive fraud, unjust enrichment, and conversion of property rights, along with emergency orders granting me exclusive use and possession of the marital residence based on separate property status and Catherine's aggressive behavior, preventing her from making any further unauthorized modifications to my estate, accessing our joint household accounts, or representing herself as property owner to any third parties, while simultaneously sending formal notice to Morrison and Associates documenting her pattern of systematic misrepresentation and requesting they investigate whether she'd made similar fraudulent claims to clients or in company materials, creating massive compliance exposure that would make her position as senior vice president legally untenable regardless of her marketing capabilities or the professional relationships she'd spent years cultivating through strategic networking that had just been exposed as elaborate performance designed to hide systematic appropriation of her husband's assets. Richard Morrison's response came within 48 hours. A terse corporate communication placing Catherine on immediate administrative leave pending investigation of serious concerns regarding misrepresentation of personal assets that may have implications for client relationships and company liability. The carefully worded language translating to what everyone in the marketing industry understood: her promotion was being rescinded, her position was under comprehensive review. And her career at Morrison and Associates was effectively over because no high-end marketing firm could retain a senior vice president who'd been publicly exposed for systematically lying about property ownership, while using company events to perpetuate fraud that had been witnessed by 150 colleagues who would never forget the executive who'd attempted to claim her husband's house as her own personal achievement. The story spreading through New York's interconnected professional networks with the kind of viral intensity that accompanies spectacular downfalls of executives whose projected images of success turn out to be built on systematic lies and fraudulent appropriation of other people's assets. Catherine's desperate attempts at damage control only accelerated her professional destruction as she sent frantic emails to colleagues trying to explain that the property situation was complicated, and I'd ambushed her with misleading documentation. But her explanations collapsed under the weight of official Westchester County records and her own fraudulent contractor invoices that had been photographed and circulated through industry channels, creating a cautionary tale about the marketing executive who tried to evict her own husband from property he legally owned. The scandal becoming legendary in corporate circles as evidence of what happens when professional arrogance meets legal reality and loses comprehensively in front of everyone whose opinion matters in your carefully constructed world of executive success. When I returned to the house accompanied by sheriff's deputies to enforce the court-ordered vacate notice 72 hours later, I found Catherine packing her belongings under official supervision. Her designer wardrobe and personal items filling boxes while the structural elements she'd claimed as her estate remained exactly where they belonged, legally titled to Robert Allen Mitchell. And when she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked, "How could you humiliate me like that in front of everyone I work with?" I simply placed the comprehensive property documentation on the marble foyer table and said, "You humiliated yourself by claiming ownership of property you never paid for while attempting to evict the legal owner through aggressive verbal assault. And I simply provided the official documentation that proved who actually owns the house you were screaming at me to leave. The humiliation was a natural consequence of systematic fraud, not an attack on your character. Though your character was certainly revealed through your willingness to lie about property ownership in pursuit of an executive image that required appropriating someone else's assets." Emma's reaction, when I sat her down to explain everything after Catherine had vacated the property, demonstrated the mature wisdom that comes from watching a step-parent's systematic territorial aggression with teenage clarity. "Dad, I'm glad she's gone because it felt like she was trying to erase us from our own house, like we were guests in her life instead of a family. And when she started telling people she designed and built everything, I knew she was lying because I remember when you bought this place before you even met her. And I'm proud of you for standing up to her instead of letting her push you out of your own home just because she was loud and entitled about claiming things that weren't hers to begin with." The legal settlement that followed over the next 8 months was as one-sided as the property documentation suggested it would be. The Scarsdale estate remained my separate property in its entirety with zero claim from Catherine. I received full reimbursement for the $42,000 in unauthorized modifications she'd fraudulently authorized using joint accounts. Mitchell Property Development was completely protected from any claims she attempted to make, and she received only her personal effects plus the minimum equitable distribution required under New York law. Her attorney advising immediate acceptance rather than prolonged litigation that would only increase her public humiliation, and the risk of criminal prosecution for the systematic fraud documented through her own invoices and email communications. While Morrison and Associates terminated her permanently for conduct fundamentally incompatible with our values of integrity and professional honesty, leaving her unemployable in the high-end marketing sector where reputation and trustworthiness were fundamental requirements for executive positions. 3 years later, Mitchell Property Development had expanded into luxury hospitality projects across Westchester County. My reputation for integrity and strategic legal positioning attracting investors who valued working with someone whose personal experience had taught him every method predatory partners use to appropriate assets through psychological manipulation and fraudulent representation. And I realized that Catherine's betrayal, devastating as it had been to experience, had ultimately freed me from a relationship that had become a hostile takeover attempt disguised as marriage, allowing me to focus on building something genuine with people who actually valued partnership, respect, and clear boundaries, rather than the entitled territorialism that had driven her to destroy our marriage through systematic appropriation of assets she'd never earned while treating me like an unwanted tenant in my own home. The most unexpected development came when I met Dr. Elizabeth Sterling, an architect whose work on sustainable design had caught my attention during a professional conference, leading to collaborations that evolved into friendship. Then romance built on mutual respect and shared contribution rather than the desperate entitlement that had driven Catherine to attempt property theft through aggressive verbal assault and fraudulent misrepresentation. And when Elizabeth met Emma, their easy rapport and genuine connection convinced me that some people enter your life not to appropriate your assets, but to help you build something better together through honest partnership and authentic collaboration that creates value rather than stealing it from others. 5 years after Catherine had screamed, "Get out of my house," at the legal owner, I stood in my Scarsdale estate watching Emma leave for Columbia University, her education funded by the accounts I'd protected from her stepmother's attempted appropriation. While Elizabeth worked beside me on blueprints for a new development project we were building together as equal partners. And I realized that Catherine's explosive confrontation had taught me that authentic ownership comes from contribution rather than entitlement, from building something valuable enough to protect rather than trying to steal what someone else has created, and understanding that the most important boundaries in life are often the ones you enforce when someone tries to take what you've built through systematic deception and aggressive appropriation disguised as domestic authority. Proving that legal ownership creates permanent reality, while entitled screaming creates only temporary noise that ends the moment someone presents irrefutable documentation to witnesses who will never forget the person who tried to claim property they'd never paid for and discovered too late that county records don't lie. Deeds don't care about your feelings. And the quiet man you dismissed as an obstacle to your executive image might possess both the legal documentation and strategic ruthlessness necessary to ensure that your moment of professional triumph becomes the stage for your complete and total destruction. witnessed by everyone who matters in your carefully constructed world of corporate success that was built on a foundation of lies about property you never owned, never earned, and had no right to claim despite your delusional conviction that marriage entitled you to everything your spouse built before you arrived to appropriate it through systematic misrepresentation and territorial aggression that ultimately cost you everything you worked to achieve once the true owner asserted his rights, and the consequences became permanent and irreversible. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.